In an out-of-the-way corner of Oklahoma, called Gray Horse, down a road you wouldn't take unless you knew what was at the other end, sits a small cemetery. It's unremarkable in many respects, until that is you look at the dates. 1923 seems to have been a particularly bad year, and when you look at the ages, it appears few died of old age.
Chapter 2, An Act of God or Man. A coroner's inquest, an investigation made up of jurors and led by a justice of the peace, was quickly held at the Ravine. Inquests were left over from a time when ordinary citizens had to investigate crimes and maintain order. For years after the American Revolution, the public opposed the creation of police departments, fearing they would become forces of repression. Instead, citizens themselves chased after suspects. In the mid-19th century, after the growth of cities, police departments began to emerge in the United States. But even by the time of Anna's death, elements of citizen policing remained in some more remote and rural places. The Justice of the Peace chose the jurors from among the white men at the Ravine, including Scott Mathis. They were charged with determining whether Anna had died by an act of God or man. If it was determined to be a felony, then they would be tasked with trying to identify who committed the crime. Two doctors, the brothers James and David Schoen, who cared for Molly's family, had been called to perform an autopsy. Leaning over Anna's body in the wooden box with members of the inquest huddled around them, they began to diagnose the dead. After the examination, the Schoen brothers determined that Anna had lost her life between 5 and 7 days earlier. The doctor shifted her head slightly and discovered a perfectly round hole in the back of her skull. "She's been shot," one of the Schoens exclaimed. There was a stirring among the men. Mathis then took a look through and thought that a .32 caliber bullet had caused the wound. There was no longer any doubt. Anna's death had been a cold-blooded murder. Lawmen were then still largely amateurs. They rarely attended training academies or learned the new scientific methods of detection, such as the analysis of fingerprints and blood patterns. Frontier lawmen, in particular, were primarily gunfighters and trackers. They were expected to stop crimes and to catch a known gunman alive if possible, dead if necessary. An officer was then literally the law and nothing but. His judgment and his trigger finger stood between him and extermination. The Tulsan Daily World said in 1928, after the death of a veteran lawman who worked in the Osage Territory. Because these enforcers received pitiful salaries and were prized primarily for being quick draws, it is not surprising that there wasn't always a clear line between good lawmen and bad lawmen. The leader of the Dalton Gang, an infamous 19th century band of outlaws, once served as the main lawman on the Osage Reservation. At the time of Anna's murder, the Osage County Sheriff was a 58-year-old, 300-pound frontiersman named Harve M. Fries. A 1916 book about the history of Oklahoma described Fries as a terror to evil doers. But there was also murmuring that he was cozy with criminals and that he gave free rein to gamblers and bootleggers, like Kelsey Morrison and Henry Grammer, a rodeo champion. Grammer had once served jail time for murder, and he controlled the local distribution of illegal liquor known as moonshine. One of his workers later admitted to authorities, "I had the assurance that if I was ever arrested, I would be turned out in 5 minutes." When Sheriff Fries was told about Anna's death, he was already busy with Whitehorn slain, and he initially sent one of his deputies to collect evidence. Fairfax had a town marshal, the equivalent of a police chief, who joined the deputy and Schoen brothers at the Ravine. To identify the murder weapon, the lawmen needed the bullet, but it was nowhere to be seen. They went down to the creek where Hannah had been found. Though there was still no sign of the bullet, one of the lawmen noticed a bottle on the ground, which was partially filled with a clear liquid. It smelled like moonshine. The lawman believed that Anna had been sitting on the rock drinking when someone came up behind her and shot her. The marshal spotted two distinct sets of car tracks running between the road and the gulch. It looked as though both cars had come into the gulch from the southeast, then circled back. No other evidence was collected. The lawmen, untrained in forensic methods, didn't make cast impressions of the tire marks or dust the bottle for fingerprints or check Anna's body for gunpowder residue. They didn't even photograph the crime scene, which, in any case, had already been contaminated by the many observers. Someone, though, found one of Anna's earrings and brought it to Molly's mother, who was too ill to travel to the creek. Lizzie instantly recognized it. Anna was dead. As with all Osage, Lizzie considered the birth of her children to be the greatest blessing of Wakonta, the mysterious force that pervades the sun and the moon and the earth and the stars. This was the force around the Osage had structured their lives for centuries, hoping to bring some order out of the chaos and confusion in the world. The force was invisible, remote, giving awesome and unanswering. Many Osage had given up their traditional beliefs, but Lizzie held on to them. Now, something had taken her oldest and most favored daughter before her allotted time, a sign, perhaps, that Wankanta had withdrawn his blessings and that the world was slipping into greater chaos. Lizzie's health grew even worse, as if grief was its own disease. Molly relied on Ernest for support. A lawyer who knew them both noted that Ernest's devotion to his Indian wife and his children is unusual and striking. He comforted Molly as she threw herself into organizing Anna's funeral. There were flowers to be purchased, along with a white metal coffin and a marble tombstone. Undertakers charged the Osage sky-high rates for a funeral, taking advantage of them. By the time the undertaker hired by Molly was done tallying the accessories, including gloves for the gravediggers, the total cost was astronomical. As a lawyer in town said, it was getting so you could not bury an Osage Indian at the cost of under $6,000, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, is the equivalent of nearly $80,000 today. The funeral was arranged to reflect the family's Osage and Catholic traditions. Molly, who had gone to a missionary school in Pawhuska, regularly attended Mass. She liked to sit in the pews as the Sunday morning light came through the windows and listen to the sermon of the priest. She also liked socializing among friends, and there was always plenty of that on Sundays. After the funeral service for Anna, Molly guided her family and the other mourners to a cemetery in Greyhorse, a quiet, isolated spot overlooking the endless prairie. Molly's father and her sister Minnie were buried there. Side by side, next to them was a freshly dug grave for Anna, with a tombstone bearing the inscription, "Meet me in heaven." Molly and her family placed enough food in the casket for Anna's 3-day journey to what the Osage refer to as the happy hunting ground. The older mourners, like Molly's mother, began to recite Osage prayer songs, hoping that Wakonta would hear them. Standing at the gravesite with Ernest, Molly could hear the old people's song of death, their chants mixed with weeping. Oda Brown, Anna's ex-husband, stepped away, looking grief-stricken. Precisely at noon, as the sun, the greatest manifestation of the great mystery, reached its zenith, Molly watched the glistening white coffin sink into the ground.
They hadn't been married long when Molly's older sister Anna was found murdered in this ravine. She was last seen heading here with 2 white men.
One of the killers held her up, and the other killer shot her right in the back of the head.